Thanks, Angela. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming in and grabbing a seat and joining us. A couple thank yous to begin with. The Alzheimer's Association has sponsored a track of presentations this week dealing with people living with Alzheimer's or other changing cognitive abilities. And so we thank them, and we thank Kimberly Clark, who supported the live streaming, too. Speaking of live streaming, a quick hello to my friends in Australia. There are a few stalwarts, I think, who are up at 2 a.m. watching the talk. So they're braver than I. I see some old friends here, and I see some new people, so I'll give you a little bit of an introduction by way of the disclosures. I'm an internist, and I'm a geriatrician. I spent 7 years in private practice. The better part of 20 years after that working as a geriatrician in long-term care communities, long-term living communities. And most recently at St. John's Home in Rochester, New York. You'll hear a bit about them. But the last few years at St. John's, I actually worked in the administration department as a culture change specialist. Started going out speaking, writing, and now for the past year have been doing the speaking and writing part full time. But I am a board member of Eden. I do have some contracted work with Eden Alternative, and I have some books and DVDs which I consider a relevant financial interest to, so I thought I'd add that to the slide. Anyway, I'd like to just talk about the rather ambitious plans I have for today. I may not get through all this because I tend to digress and tell stories and go off on tangents, and that's okay. We'll just see what we come up with. But what I'd love to do, and you know, I'm kind of like Steve Shields was this morning. I'm not sure that we'll ever really be able to stop talking about this, but I'd like to end the drug debate once and for all, at least for the Pioneer Network. You know, I've presented here many times. I've gone through all the exquisite detail about what is wrong with the drug studies, the use of antipsychotics and dementia. I wrote a whole chapter on it in my first book, and I want to move on to what works. And so I'm going to try to make a few more comments today, and then hopefully, if and when I ever come back to the Pioneer, we won't talk about antipsychotics. We'll just move forward from here. And you can see some of the things I'm going to do. A lot of paradigm shifting. I remember way back early in my career of culture change, working with Dr. Bill Thomas. He once said that, you know, you can't tweak the medical model of long-term care. You have to transform it. And Steve Shields said basically the same thing this morning. And I've decided you cannot tweak the way we are approaching dementia. We really have to transform it. And that required a lot of change on my part, a lot of internal struggle and external struggle. So I'm going to share some of that with you on the way to having you see kind of how I look at all this. We're going to talk about culture change. One of the biggest failings of trying to come up with better ways to care for people living with dementia is that we do not tie it into the culture change movement, because without that, you cannot get anywhere as far as new ways of supporting people. And you know, I may not be able to do all these things, but I'm really going to spend a lot of time on well-being and what it is, and it's a little different than what we usually measure, and how can you actually operationalize that in different living environments. And show you maybe a radically different way to look at distress or different personal expressions that may be hard to understand. I may not get through everything, but two things I really want to do today is, number one, leave some time at the end for discussion. I'm hoping to leave a good space of time because I think sometimes the best value comes from the question and answer. And the other thing that I promised to do today is to push a few buttons. And once again, Steve Shields said, you know, we can't just be complacent. We have to change. We have to work on how we can challenge each other, challenge ourselves in a respectful way. And I'm not a confrontational person by any stretch, but one thing that has worked for me in using this well-being framework that you're going to hear about is that it is a set of values that we all believe in, that we all can agree are important to us and will always be important to us. And the nice thing about using a value or principle-based framework is it's like a code of ethics. So if I want to create a challenge, it's not about I'm wrong and I'm right and someone else is wrong, or I'm good and someone else is bad. It's about, if we believe in these values, do our practices and our actions really reflect these values, or don't they? And if they don't, how can we change them? I'm going to back this up because I got some people behind me here that probably don't want to look at this the whole time, and I probably won't use it much. So anyway, I think it's valuable to push the envelope. And I'll start right away with terminology. I was just saying outside that I think maybe the biggest barrier to culture change is not I don't like it. I think the biggest barrier is actually we're already doing it. because I think there are a lot of people who think that if they do a couple things that they can just sit back and that's the end of it. And I think that sometimes it's that good to great phenomenon where if you're doing a bit, you don't think you need to do more. So I'm always challenging myself. I'm always trying to change. I agree that culture change is not a great term. I'd love to actually move beyond person-centered care. So with apologies to a lot of people that use that, I think that we can go beyond that, and I'm going to push lots of buttons. With apologies to the Eden Alternative, my beloved organization, I want to move beyond person-directed care. With apologies to Mike Nolan, I want to move beyond relationship-centered care. First of all, one of the problems is the word care. The word care actually narrows the world of the person who is living an aging experience. As Carter Williams suggested, it's restraints that are not physical, but restraints on living opportunities. Now, I belong to Eden. I understand that Eden defines care as helping another to grow. It's much more holistic than just medical treatment. But in 20 years, we still have a very narrow societal view around the word care. So if you want to be person-centered, person-directed, relationship-centered, I'd suggest replace the word care with living. Let's talk about person-centered living, person-directed living. And actually, I see Jessica Lou Kim here, who worked with Dr. Sherry Dupuy in the University of Waterloo. I love their term, authentic partnerships. I mean, that has relationship, it has direction, it has all those things, and it takes that messy word care right out of the equation. So just something for you to think about. This visualization, I thought I'd start with this. I don't know if this works or not. I just thought of it very recently. I've never tried it before. It might be lame. You can tell me if it is. But you might agree it's kind of basic, but you know, we got to start with the basics because you'd be surprised, even if you think this is a simplistic kind of thing, how much we then turn around and we forget it in 2 minutes. So let's just pretend for a moment each of you, you or your significant other has been awarded an opportunity to do a fellowship, to go and work on a project in another country for a year. And you can visualize any country you want. I'm just going to give you 2 guidelines. It has to be a country whose primary language is not English and where you are not fluent in that primary language. Now, you're excited about this. You haven't had a lot of warning, so you haven't had time to become fluent, but you figure you'll pick it up as you go along. And so you relocate and you move into your new apartment where you're going to be for a year, and you decide to treat yourself. You're going to be hard at work, so you're going to go out to the store and you're going to buy yourself a nice new coffee maker, okay? Because you want to be able to get up and have that cappuccino, that espresso, whatever gets you going in the morning. And so you go to the store and you spend probably more money than you wanted to on a really fancy thing that does all these things, probably starts your car remotely and everything else. And you take it home and the next morning you get up and you plug it in and you push that button and nothing happens. The circuitry is fried, the thing's not working, it's obviously a dud. So you're a little bit miffed that you spent all this money for something that wasn't built right, and you put it in the box, take it back, find the sales clerk, and unfortunately you're not real fluent and the sales clerk is not real good at English. And you're trying to explain to her that this thing doesn't work, and she's trying to explain to you that they have a no exchange policy because she thinks you just don't like the style. And you two can't connect with each other, and you're getting more and more frustrated. And finally the manager comes over, and she doesn't understand you very well either because her English is limited, and your ability to understand her is limited. And she can see you getting angry and frustrated and red in the face. And so finally she says, "Excuse me," and she goes away and brings back a glass of water and a little red pill and says in her best English, "Take this, you'll feel better." Does that fix your problem? No. Okay. Pretty obvious, pretty basic, okay? Let's take it one step farther. Suppose instead of giving you a pill, she goes away and she comes back and brings a gentleman who takes you to a quiet space and says, "Here's a basket of laundry, fold this, you'll feel better." Or, "Here's some music, listen to it, you'll feel better." Or, "Here's some aromatherapy hand massage, do this, you'll feel better." Does any of those fix your problem? Okay, now that's a little bit different challenge, isn't it? Now I'm not here to say that those activities are never good. Sometimes they can be good, but if we are too intervention focused, we don't really understand what's behind the person. So I'm not going to talk about interventions today. Those are tools. They're part of the picture. They're not the big picture. What I want to talk to you about today is how do you fix the coffee maker, not cover it up with something else, okay? It's a different kind of thing. So a few words about drugs. Like I said, the last words maybe. We know that antipsychotic prescribing has skyrocketed. The #1 selling drug in the US last year, Abilify, $1.6 billion. in sales. Pretty huge. And we know it's promoted for many other things. It actually is not approved for dementia. It's certainly promoted for things like schizophrenia, for which it was developed, but also conditions like bipolar disorder with mania or depression with psychosis, other conditions. But there's only one population that's increasing anywhere near the rate that this drug prescribing is increasing. And that's the number of older people, and in particular, older people living with dementia. And even though we can't get a handle on that completely, we know that nearly 30% of those prescriptions were dispensed by long-term care pharmacies when it was last measured. So we know where these pills are going. Now, we've done pretty well with our CMS initiatives. We're down around 20%, but also keep in mind that 20% is all people. That's counting everybody who lives in a nursing home with and without dementia. So we have some people without dementia who probably are not mostly on medications, diluting that number. If you look at the number of people with a diagnosis of Alzheimer's or other types of dementia and look at their usage, it's probably still in the 30% or more range. It was close to 40% a few years ago. So we still have a long way to go. And I just love this last statistic. Medicaid spends more money on antipsychotics than it does on antibiotics or heart disease medications. So that's pretty striking. Now, I'm not going to go through all the things I've gone through in previous talks. I'm going to say a couple of bold statements. Number one, antipsychotics are ineffective and dangerous. I'm sorry, that's where I'm at. And if you want to talk about the details, we can do that during the question and answer or afterward. But this is really the conclusion I've reached and where I've gone. It was so heartening to be at a focus group in Washington, D.C. and hear Jonathan Evans, who was the immediate past president of AMDA, the Medical Directors Association, say that he has stopped prescribing antipsychotics in dementia. He's stopped. And what a great shift that has been. But I do want to talk about that. I'll talk about a couple ideas from the old book and from the old talks that maybe are new to you, just to give you a little more ammunition. I spent some time about a year or two ago looking at the neurochemistry of dementia as opposed to schizophrenia, and I learned some interesting things that I suspected but had to confirm. You know, schizophrenia, one of the problems, even though it's not this simple, is that we think that there's upregulation of dopamine activity in the brain. There's too much dopamine going on. And when that happens, people with schizophrenia start hearing things. They start having delusions where the TV is talking to them and telling them things in a persecutory manner. And so using a drug that blocks dopamine action is actually, it has some rationale, because you bring that level down to more of a normal level. And that's what antipsychotics are. They're dopamine blocking drugs. Now, when you look at Alzheimer's, when you look at other forms of dementia, there is no increase in dopamine. Most of them have a decrease in dopamine activity, or at most normal. So there is no rationale to block dopamine in a person that doesn't have enough already. All you are doing is sedating people. There is nothing there that is changing that milieu the way you would with somebody with schizophrenia. Now, how about something like Lewy body dementia? You know, what's going on there? Well, we know that people with Lewy body dementia often have visions. Sometimes they're flashing lights. Sometimes they look like well-formed hallucinations, like children playing outside the door. But there is damage to the visual part of the brain in Lewy body dementia. There are sick nerve cells that are firing off images. That's not dopamine, and that doesn't respond to antipsychotic drugs. As a matter of fact, those drugs are more dangerous because people with Lewy body dementia are extremely sensitive to the effects of dopamine blockers, and they're dangerous drugs to give. So, you know, think of phantom pain. You amputate someone's leg, and they have a feeling like their foot hurts, even though there's no longer a foot there. Once again, that's a damaged nerve sending signals. That's not going to respond to this kind of treatment. Now, the other thing I'm going to say, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but this leads to this because you may have this question, and that is, what about the people who are delusional or who are hallucinating? What do you do for them? Well, I'm going to give you something you will not read in any medical textbook, nursing textbook, or any literature on dementia. It is completely against the mainstream. I believe, from my years of experience and my way of looking at dementia, that the vast majority, almost all people, are not hallucinating, are not delusional, and we have mislabeled them. So let's think about the game Wheel of Fortune for a moment. This is something new I've come up with to explain this. Wheel of Fortune, you've all seen it, right? Pat Sajak, Vanna White. And you have a word or phrase or expression up there, and it's all covered up with blank squares. And you guess letters, and as you guess right, the letters are slowly revealed. What happens in dementia is kind of like that too, because you lose access to certain bits of information in your brain. You can't open those doors. So you have a partial view. And you know this sometimes early on when you can see a little bit of the word, people do three things. If they're really sharp, they might guess it. But more often they either guess wrong or they just say, I don't know. And sometimes when you get a few letters, you might have an idea. And if you and I kind of had an in on what the word was, if they had, you know, Statue of Liberty up there, but they're only an S and an L and an F and a couple letters, you know, a person might guess, you know, Statute of Limitations, or they might say, you know, states of lunacy. And if we know the answer, that seems really funny and kind of comical to us. But that is the best the person can do with the information they have. Well, I think a lot of the things that we call delusions are the same thing. People's brains are not dead. They're active. They're constantly problem solving, trying to take what they do know and their changing experience to make sense of the world. And they don't always get it right because they don't have the information. That doesn't respond to antipsychotic drugs. That is a different kind of mechanism. And the danger with calling it a hallucination or delusion is it brings us into psychiatric thinking, brings us into thinking about schizophrenia, and leads us to use these drugs we shouldn't use. So just a few words about that. But here's the bigger issue, and that is that antipsychotics are not the problem. There's a researcher in my area who just published a journal article in a huge journal, you know, studying the effects of Depakote on behavioral distress in people with dementia, because he's concerned about antipsychotics. But if that manager in the appliance store had brought you a white pill instead of a red pill, would she have fixed your coffee maker? The problem is not antipsychotics. We've identified them because of their danger. The problem is the notion that people need to take a pill. That's really what's wrong here. And so we have to step back and say, what's bigger than all this? So let's just take a moment and say, you know, this is also not a nursing home problem. We get all the attention in long-term care, those of you who work in long-term care, because we have this thing called the MDS. Anybody here ever hear of the MDS? Do I have to explain that to you? So we have demographic instruments that tell us things about people, clinical things, demographic things. We know just by hitting a computer switch, I can go to any nursing home that you may work at and find out what your percent of antipsychotic prescribing is. You can't do that in assisted living. You can't do that in people's own homes or apartments because we don't have any way to collect that and they're not FDA approved. So no one's got that data. Now, a couple of people have done some studies. You can see there, Ann Kolonowski, who's very active in this community, was one of the people. And there are some small studies looking at antipsychotic use in the community. The numbers, you know, vary, and the sample sizes are not huge. But even though the numbers at times even look a little lower than what we have in nursing homes, remember that for every person living in a nursing home, there are probably at least 4 or 5, if not more, in the community living with Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia. So when you look at absolute numbers, if there are 300 or 350,000 people in nursing homes getting antipsychotics right now for their dementia, there are probably 1 million or more living in their homes taking the same thing. I did a study at St. John's where I worked, a very large community, where I just went through and found all the people who had moved in the last year, and I cross-correlated whatever their mini mental state exam was after moving in with what they were taking at home before they moved to the nursing home. And I found that if that Folstein score got down to 10 or less, that they were actually 50% of them, half of them were taking antipsychotics in their own homes. So this is a societal paradigm. This is not a problem just for the skilled care community. So this is the pill paradigm, which I talk about quite often, and it comes from a lot of deep-seated societal patterns and beliefs. First of all, there's all the stigma that surrounds Alzheimer's, that surrounds people with changing cognition. We'll talk about that some more in a moment. There is this idea of ageism and also ableism. We have a society, as you know, that values people less who do less, who produce less. If you don't work the most jobs or pull in the biggest salary or score the most points on the playing field, you're not as visible in our society. And because older people often are not still engaged in gainful employment or maybe are less active than they were before, they tend to have less value. We also tend to devalue people who are less able, regardless of age. So when you mix age and ability, which often happens in people living with dementia, you see a group that may be the least valued people of all. And so this is a big part of it. There's also this societal desire for the quick fix. And with that goes this relentless marketing of pharmaceuticals as the answer to our needs. Just watch TV for about 5 minutes and you see the commercials. Got a problem? Take a pill. Got another problem? Here's another pill. Are those pills giving you problems? Here's a pill for those two, okay? I mean, that's what we do, basically. And these are all fueled and supported by what I call a narrow biomedical view of dementia. So I want to talk a little bit because this is where I started. As Steve said this morning, you talk about the struggle. And I really started inwardly by challenging myself. What have I been taught? What is my barrier to getting people off of these drugs and finding better ways to support them? And I looked back at what I've been taught and what you've all been taught, this model of dementia, which I call the biomedical model. And these are some of the characteristics of what we have all been taught about dementia. It's a constellation of degenerative diseases of the brain. It tends to be progressive for most people. It's incurable. It's ultimately fatal for a lot of people. And we tend to focus on those losses, on those deficits. Even our cognitive scales all talk about what a person can no longer do. And they only see one dimension, which goes like, well, let me mirror image. It goes like this, basically. This is the curve of Alzheimer's and just about every other form of dementia. It doesn't see growth or ability happening within there. It's just, what have you lost? Devolving day to day. Our policy really focuses on costs and burdens. Burdens for individuals, burdens for families, for care systems. And we put most of our money and most of our resources into drug research to try to find a cure. Now, there is nothing inherently wrong with anything I said. You've all lived and worked with people who live with these illnesses, and you know that these things happen all the time. But what this is a narrow view. It's a deficit-based view. And when you have the blinders on, you miss a lot of things. And there's a lot of fallout, both for those individuals and for the people who support them. And this is some of the fallout you get. First of all, when we think about how do we create well-being, we almost always look to drug therapy. And that's why we put all our money in drug research, because we think if we can slow the progress of the illness, people all of a sudden have beautiful lives. And we think that if someone is distressed, that we need to give them a pill. We also tend to ignore what people say, because our teaching says that they're confused, and therefore what they say, we can't trust it. It's not evidence-based enough. I think that's a big mistake, as you will see. And we're very quick to stigmatize. Even the people that try most to support those with dementia refer to it as the long goodbye, as people fading away, as a living death, an empty shell. And we're not bad people. We do it because we try to raise public awareness. But in doing so, we actually stigmatize, diminish, and dehumanize the people that we're actually trying to support. And there's a reason why that's important, if you think about it. And David Edwardson said this in an article many years ago. If you believe the person's no longer there, what happens to your ethical obligation to give them humane care? It kind of goes away, doesn't it? And I'm not saying that there's frank abuse and neglect occurring throughout our society. There's some. But there are these little subtle things that we've all done, myself included, that diminish that person because we expect less. No need to bring her to the care plan. She won't understand what's going on anyway. Doesn't matter if we switch the people that bathe him. He doesn't know their names. It won't matter if we rotate staff. Okay, we do lots of little things that actually we would never want for ourselves, but for some reason we diminish the humanity of that person because we expect less from them. We're very quick to disempower people, create these institutional approaches to care. And when people are distressed, we see it as a manifestation of disease. He's wandering because he has dementia. She's striking out in the shower because she has dementia. And that blinds us from other ideas. Now, we're going to take a couple of inevitable consequences of dementia today, and we're going to cure them, too. I'll just let you know that that's going to happen. So I'm going to give you some magical stuff going on. But let me tell you an example of how quickly the stigma starts. This is Ed Voris, a gentleman I've met a couple times out in San Francisco. He got together with a couple of friends of mine, Dr. Nader Shabahangi and Dr. Patrick Fox, and they wrote a book called Conversations with Ed, where they discussed his experience of living positively with Alzheimer's and really got into the philosophy behind dementia and the way our society sees it. It's a very rich and very challenging discussion. And in this book, Ed tells the story of his diagnosis several years ago, now more than 5 years ago. And when Ed was first diagnosed, it was not a matter of people telling him he had a problem. Ed was acting to all observers quite normally, but he knew his brain wasn't working the way it should. He was having more trouble calling up words and phrases. He was losing his car at the mall. Well, okay, we've all done that. But he knew that his brain map, his going back through to figure out what store did I come in, how did I get here, it was drawing too many blanks. So it was actually Ed who took himself to his doctor and said, I'm having trouble doing these things. I think I should be tested for Alzheimer's. So Ed went through the tests, all the cognitive X-ray lab tests, you know, and it turned out he did have early stage Alzheimer's. Unfortunately, the way Ed found out was 3 weeks later, he got a letter from his doctor with the word dementia on top and 3 pages of instructions. Great, right? So Denise worries about my bedside manner, but it's still better than some, in spite of my separation from the day's hands-on practice. So Ed was distressed. He had a very distressing diagnosis. He wasn't quite sure what to do. He hopped in his car, drove to his local Alzheimer's support chapter on the West Coast, walked in the door and said, hi, my name is Ed Voris. I've just been diagnosed with early stage Alzheimer's, and I'm here for some support and some resources. And the person at the desk said, where's your family? Where's your advocate? And he said, I'm here to advocate for myself. And the person said, I can't talk to you. Come back when you're with your family. Now that's how fast it happens. He went to 3 different organizations, AAA type organizations, got the same answer, okay? So just because he said, I've been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, he was immediately seen as somebody who couldn't make an appointment, take a brochure, process information. And this by the people who are most charged to be supportive and knowledgeable about it. Now, I'm not saying this to blame people or to point fingers. We have all sold people short because of that label. It's what Tom Kitt would call positioning, expecting less of people, putting the disease before the person. So we don't do this because we're bad or lazy or uncaring, but we have a paradigm, and that's this narrow deficit-based view of dementia that we've all been taught. So I realized, as my friend, he's not really my friend, but as Deepak Chopra said, that instead of thinking outside the box, maybe I needed to get rid of the box, because it's a very powerful box. And even if I stand outside it, it's there in the corner reminding me of all those things that I've been doing for all these years. And I struggled with this. We're now back to about 7 or 8 years ago, trying to figure out what to do next. And it was then that I began hearing a different group of voices. And these are people who I consider the experts on dementia, the true experts. I don't call myself an expert. I call myself a professional student of dementia. And I am embarrassed to say as a doctor that I wasn't listening enough to this group of experts. But they are actually the people who live with dementia and who talk to us about it and share their wisdom with us. People like Dr. Richard Taylor, Christine Bryden from Australia, Jim Mann from Vancouver, Ed Voris up there. And I realized a couple things. Number one, that I needed to listen to what they were saying and appreciate their experience. And I read their books, heard them talk. I was often challenged by what they said, but I had to appreciate that they had a perspective that I could not completely understand. And you cannot completely duplicate it. You can put Vaseline on goggles and you can put earplugs in and do those things, but you can't quite replicate the experience of having a processor in your brain that's not working the way it used to. So I came up with a new definition, and this was my attempt to define what's going on in the brains of people who live with these illnesses that was neutral, non-judgmental, non-stigmatized, but also took that experience into account. And so what I came up with was dementia is a shift in the way a person experiences the world around her or him. Now it's kind of fuzzy. If I were a drug researcher, this isn't going to help me. But for those of us outside the lab who aren't going to come up with the next medication, this is actually, I think, a better definition. First of all, it's universal. Each one of us through our lives has had a change in the way we experience the world. Through aging, through our growth, through our meeting new people and having new experiences. So this connects us to people with dementia. Traditional biomedical definitions separate us. They say these people have a disease or they have 50 different diseases. We don't understand them. That's not a way to get new insights. Connecting ourselves, looking through people's eyes is actually the way to find out other things. And so I went down a different road. I started going down a very different road. And these are just a few examples of what happened to me when I started going down this different road. One of the first things when I met my good friend Richard Taylor, when I saw him speak at Alzheimer's Disease International about 5 years ago, he said, I am not dying of a fatal disease. I'm living with a chronic disability. Now that really blew my mind. First of all, he went from dying to living. I'm not gone, I'm here. And number two, he went from fatal disease to chronic disability. Now, I'm not here to bring up the argument of what is Alzheimer's, is it a disease, how much it is part of aging. We don't have to go there and even have that discussion. It doesn't matter. The disabilities are obviously real enough. But when you see it as, let's go beyond, let's be even more enlightened, let's call it different ability, changing ability. When you see it that way, it opens your mind to things you hadn't seen before. Our research goals with dementia, basically, are to slow decline and keep people alive longer, if possible. That's where most of our drug therapy has been aimed. Is that our goal with people with disabilities? Our goal with people with disabilities is to continue to engage them fully with life, to give them opportunities to learn, to grow, to have a lot of agency in directing their lives, to have important jobs or volunteer opportunities throughout the community, to remain connected. We took them out of institutions long ago and put them back mixed with regular society. So when you see dementia as a disability or as a changing ability, you have a different landscape as to what might be possible for people. And you realize that what people are telling you is very important to understand. And it's not just the Richard Taylors and the Christine Brydens who are so articulate, but that person in front of me who's saying something that makes no sense to me, I realized I had to understand that that person is teaching me something about his experience, and that I had to try my best to understand that too if I was going to support that person. When I think about the disability movement that's been going on for the past 20 or 30 years, I started thinking about ramps. And I realized, that if we were here, and, I came up the steps and the escalator and everything, but, if I were in a wheelchair, if I were a young, we'll say a football player for the Kansas City Chiefs who had a tragic spine injury and could no longer move my legs, then I wouldn't be able to get up the steps to come to this talk. I'd be stuck. But thanks to our ADA laws, we have ramps and other types of disability access. And the reason we do that is we want people who can't walk or who can't walk well to be able to continue to succeed in a world of people who do walk, right? And I realized when I thought of dementia this way that we're not building ramps for people with dementia. And in this case, I'm not talking so much about wheelchair ramps. I'm talking about cognitive ramps, brain ramps. Your brain is changing. Your experience of the world is shifting. And instead of trying to understand and accommodate that, we create living environments that are based on our view of the world, our schedules, in the case of care homes, our staffing needs. And we expect the person with the changing brain to just fit there. And when she can't, we call it a behavior problem and give her these powerful medications. Imagine that guy in the wheelchair. Suppose he only had a stair step to get up here. And suppose, Denise and I walked up to him, and, well, Denise would hobble up to him at this point, but I'm going to give you a hard time because you're sitting right in the front. Denise and I walk up to him, and we say, listen, we all walk up the steps, so we'd like you to do that too. So we're going to help you up, and we lift him up by the arms, tip him forward, and let go, and what's going to happen to that guy? It's going to go right in his face, right? Because his legs don't work that way anymore. And if he's lying there on the steps, yelling at us because we dropped him, it would be pretty silly of me to turn and say, well, Denise, he has a bit of a behavior problem, doesn't he? Why don't we give him a little Seroquel and see if we can calm him down? Now, I know people smile, they laugh, that sounds silly, but we do that every day in all living environments for people living with dementia. We expect them to conform to our world, and when they can't, we blame their disease and we medicate them. So this is where we have to make a huge shift. We have to realize that the people who are most able to change actually are the people who don't live with dementia. And we have to find a way to accommodate that. So we also have to understand that people are still growing. It's not just decline. There is growth all the time. You would never say that a person with MS that's getting progressively weak couldn't grow as a person. So why do we say that about Alzheimer's? It doesn't make any sense. And we realize, as Jim Mann said, that he's not who he used to be, but he has what he calls a new normal. We have to understand there's a new normal. We can't change the person to be who they were any more than I can run 10K like I did when I was in college many, many years ago. So we start to change our goals and say, how do we support this person? Or as they say, Schlegel Villages, living in my today. How do we help that person by living in their today? We stop trying to just base quality of life scales on what people can and can't do, or how good their cognitive scores are, or what their functional status is. Those are important things to work on, but there are other things that we need that reach beyond our abilities. And how can we cultivate those for people? And so it led me to challenge a lot of things. In other words, when I started with this kind of flaky definition of dementia, it changed everything for me. So here's another way of looking at something in 3 different ways, talking about delusions. Here's something you often hear from a family member. Dad has totally lost it. He thought I was his father instead of his son. He's gone beyond recognition. Anybody hear anything like that before? Probably. Here's what Richard Taylor says. If I call you mom or dad, I'm probably not confusing you with my mom or dad. I know they're dead. I may be thinking about the feelings and behaviors I associate with mom and dad. I miss those feelings. I need them. I just so closely associate those feelings with my mom and dad that the words I use become interchangeable when I talk about them. And that, and something Christine Bryden said, led me to a really cool communication tip that you got to remind me to share with you a little bit later. But here's Dr. Nader Shabahangi, my Zen master, when it comes to looking at what he calls forgetfulness in a different way than I've been taught. And Nader says, old people often use an object like a wedding ring to symbolize something from the past. A person in present time like yourself can represent a mother or sister. When old people combine one thought with another, they are often poetic. So we have delusional on one point, we have poetic on the other. It's a very different way of looking at the same kinds of expressions. So one more metaphor to get you through the shift, and then we're going to move to the main theme of this talk, and that is, does cough syrup cure pneumonia? This is important too, and this is where I start my new book, and I tell people at the end of the book to go back and read the prologue again because it's so important. This is where we get stuck. We are looking at the person's expressions as the problem instead of a symptom of something larger. And that's why the person with the broken coffee maker got a pill or an intervention instead of fixing their coffee maker, okay? In my visualization at the beginning. If I only saw the cough, if Kevin came to me with pneumonia and he's coughing his brains out because people with pneumonia often do that, if that's all I saw, I would say, Kevin, I've diagnosed your problem. You've got a bad cough. So I'm going to give you some cough syrup and we're going to take care of that. And I might quiet the cough for a while, but that pneumonia is still there. It's still festering, and eventually he's going to get worse because I didn't address the real issue. And I think with our interventions, whether they be pharmacologic or not, we tend to do that. We tend to react to the moment. And we may calm somebody, and if it works, we put it in the care plan, and we say, do this and it will calm her. And then what happens tomorrow at the same time? It happens again and again. And that's why it's so hard to stop pills and to really give people something better. So here's a couple other secrets I want to share with you that I think are a little challenging. I think that the primary goal is not to reduce antipsychotics. Now, I have said many times that antipsychotics are the restraints of the 21st century. I do believe they will become the rare exception if we get that learning curve going. But you don't start there. And as good as CMS is to say reduce by X%, and organizations to say we will do that, it's a little bit cart before the horse. If you don't know how to care differently, eventually those people, when they're not as sedated, are going to have periods of distress, and you're not going to know what else to do. I also don't believe our primary goal is to reduce distress. Now, once again, I don't want people who live with dementia to be distressed. But distress is the cough. It's not the pneumonia. So what's the real goal? How do you fix that coffee maker? The real goal, I believe, is to create what I'm going to call well-being. And I'm going to give you one model of well-being. There are many out there that are very good. You don't have to use this one, but I needed a framework that I could work with and teach. And I like this because it's easy for me to understand. It's easy for me to explain to others. It came from a white paper that a group of culture change specialists wrote with a grant from the Eden Alternative back in 2005. And they said, you know, so many of our quality of life scales are still based on your medical health and your functional status. But, you know, with those definitions, a person with dementia could never have quality of life because they're never going to be better in those ways. So what are those things that we all need, regardless of age, background, or ability, that we have to cultivate in all people? And they came up with what they call 7 domains of well-being. So there's identity, having that story, that personhood. There's connectedness, and I don't have to tell anybody in this room that it's all about relationships. It's all about belonging, where you are with the people around you, even the non-tangible things like belonging with your God. That's connectedness as well. Security, more than an alarm on the door of the nursing home. Security is emotional security. It's feeling like you know and trust those who come up to you, who lay hands on you and provide support. It's being treated with dignity. It's all those things, finding a balance between too much and too little in daily life. Autonomy, a huge thing, having choice and control, so important. And you know, there's another kind of autonomy too, which I was reminded of when I was doing a seminar in England a couple of years ago, and that is emotional autonomy. This is an interesting one to challenge you a little bit. when we live with the diagnosis of Alzheimer's, do we have the right to express our emotions the way everybody else does without being judged for it? I was giving a talk on this in Mississippi last year, and on the way back, I stopped at an airport in Washington to switch planes, and we were waiting, and the gate agent came on and said, we're having a little mechanical problem with the plane. We have a mechanic working on it, but we may be a little late in boarding. We'll get it done as fast as we can. I'll get back to you in a few minutes. Well, there was a businessman in a three-piece suit sitting next to me, and he got up and kind of stormed over to the gate agent, and in a very sarcastic voice, he started saying, "No, I'm not angry. I just want to ask you one question. Have you ever had a plane that has ever left on time from this airport? Have you ever had one plane that's left on time?" You know, just being really annoying. And she maintained her poise. He went and sat down again. Well, as luck would have it, 10 minutes later, she said, "I'm sorry, we're still working on the problem. We've decided to bring another plane into service as a backup. We're going to keep working on it, but if we can't fix it, it may take up to an hour to get you out of here." Well, this guy stood up, stormed out to make other arrangements, and as he stormed out, he swore at the top of his lungs, and he kicked the garbage can forcefully as he walked out. Now, the punchline is that 5 minutes later, we fixed the problem and left without him. But the more important message is I was thinking, suppose this had been a gentleman who had been told that he couldn't go outside for a walk, couldn't go through a locked or alarmed door, and had done that. What would our reaction have been? Emotional ability, frontotemporal dementia, medication, he's obviously out of control, right? So, you know, as Albert Camus once said, it takes a lot of energy just to be normal sometimes. And we expect a level of normality from people that have these labels that is much more than we would expect from ourselves. So that's autonomy too. Meaning, doing things that actually fulfill a purpose for you, that actually speak to your personal history, your strengths, your abilities, your spirituality, whatever it is. What are the rituals in your life? What are the things you do to help others, to be a care partner, not just a care recipient? And there's another part of meaning too, which I get to in my book. I'm not going to get to it too much here, but I will talk to it when I mention that clue I was going to give you about communication. And that is, what is the meaning behind what people say and do? How do we better understand what they're trying to tell us? And so I addressed that as well, although that was not the original intent of this word in this paper. Growth. People do grow living with dementia. They do self-actualize as people. And joy is pretty self-explanatory. So let's talk about wandering. Let's cure wandering. That'll be the first condition we'll cure. People often come to me and say, can you help me with somebody? She's wandering. She has a problem with wandering. And once again, that's the cough pneumonia thing, right? She has a problem with wandering. So the first thing I do is I talk about the word. To me, the word, sorry, Joe, I tend to pace. I'll try to stay in your field of vision. The problem with wandering is that it's a little judgmental. It suggests to me confused activity, and it doesn't help me understand. So one thing I'll tell people to do is to change the word to searching. And just ask yourself, what is she searching for? And sometimes that's helpful. Sometimes you can find something when you use that type of a thinking process. But I find often that even that doesn't give you the answer. Even when someone says, I want to go home, they're often not thinking about that house at 35 Elm Street with the green shutters and the front porch and rose garden. What people are often looking for that they're not finding is actually this stuff here. A place where they feel safe and secure, where they feel like they belong, where they know the people around them, where they have meaningful engagement going on during the day. And because we want to be, you know, enlightened and not restrain them, we might build a circular courtyard or, you know, take the clutter off the floor, put alarms and stop signs on the stairwells, and we might put a pretty picture on the elevator door so it doesn't look like an elevator. And we do that, and the person stays safe, and so we feel good. But does the wandering stop? We didn't give them what they were really looking for. We were covering up. We weren't looking for the real need. So we have to give well-being to people if we want to actually attend this. So how can you, is wandering inevitable when you have dementia? Well, at St. John's Home, where I worked for 13 years, one of the things I'm proud of having a little part in was opening 2 greenhouse homes. And the one thing we did that no one else in the world has, and no one else in the long-term care world has done with greenhouses, is that they are not next to our nursing home and they are not on an elder living campus. We actually moved them 11 miles away and put them in a real multi-generational residential community. I'll disagree with Steve Shields slightly. Some more regulations need to change. We had to fight the powers that be to do that. We were not able to do it at St. John's Home. We had to get a new license. Had to take on almost $500,000 redundancy costs in the first year of operation because they wouldn't let us do it as part of St. John's. So there are still some regs that need to be changed because, to me, getting people off campus and into communities is part of how we are going to respond to our aging boom. So we have to, we took it on, we took all the bruising because we had to show that this was viable. Now later we're back in the black as far as operations. I still say we, even though I'm not there because I identify with this project. They've had 3 annual state surveys deficiency-free and 1 horrendous, but ultimately deficiency-free federal survey too. So they are doing amazing things and they're teaching me things. And there are many stories in my new book about what's happened in those greenhouses because I've learned about what's possible. Now, even though the homes are beautiful and the staff are incredible people, we took 20 people for these 2 houses, 10 in each, from our large campus and moved them and took staff members and moved them. So they were all coming together for the first time. And this was a new environment. Anytime a person who is forgetful moves, that can be stressful, just like it is for all of us. So some people live with dementia, and these houses are integrated. They're not separated, dementia versus non. But some of the people living there with dementia would try to leave the first several days, weeks that they were there. And so we did the usual thing. We had alarms and keypads on the door, and we gave them the Wander Guard bracelets, so if they started to go out the door, the alarm would trigger. But at the same time, the Shabazim were developing relationships. They were starting to understand well-being and cultivate that, get to know people, get to know their personal rhythms. And after several weeks, they had a team meeting because the alarms were loud and they were very disturbing to the life of the home. And they sat down and said, what are we going to do about this? And they started looking at it critically and they realized something amazing. People were walking too close to the sensor, but no one was trying to leave anymore. So they took a deep breath, they cut off every one of those bracelets, and for over 2 years now, no one's wearing an alarm bracelet and no one tries to leave. So you can cure these things if you give people what they really need. And this shows how a well-being focus takes you so much deeper than what we're used to, combined with a really, truly transformational approach to living. Now, not everybody likes this. Not everybody likes to be told how to think of well-being, but I'm going to suggest an Al's-Lowe's type hierarchy of these 7 domains I gave you. Because I think that if you are going to help try to restore well-being in people who are losing it, there's a logical order, a pathway you might consider following. And in my hierarchy, I believe identity and connectedness are at the bottom. They're very closely in tune with each other. And let's face it, if you want someone to feel safe, or if you want to give somebody, safe empowerment, if you don't know them or don't have a meaningful relationship, you're not going to do very well with that. So I think just like the Pioneer values say, the 2 most basic values of any good transformational model are know the person and have close relationships. Once you do that, then you can create the trust, familiarity to create a sense of security. You can know the person so you can know whether or not they're trying to leave and whether or not they need a bracelet. You can then start to empower people within reasonable guidelines and help people to make reasonably safe choices to improve their quality of life. And once people feel safe and feel more empowered, then they can engage in activities that are truly meaningful. Not the guise of meaning, not making people feel useful, but actually things where they can be useful. And that enables personal growth and sustained joy. So I just happen to like this hierarchy. Take it or leave it, whatever you like. Now I'm going to give some kudos once again to Jessica over here in the group at the University of Waterloo in Merup. Jessica used to be with the Murray Alzheimer Research and Education Program up in Ontario. And they do something pretty unusual. They have participatory action research. They actually have a community panel of people living with Alzheimer's who advise them on their research and their outcomes and help work as advisors to them in what they should study and how they should do it. They've composed a group of guides, by us, for us guides, for people living with dementia, helping teach other people with the diagnosis how they can live better. And one of the things they did was they're trying to move away from this idea of programmed activities toward more organic, individualized leisure experiences. And as part of the research, they asked 200 people in the US and Canada living with dementia, what are your favorite leisure experiences? What are the important moments in your life and what makes them important to you? And they took all their answers and they got their panel and they put them into 7 boxes. And they labeled those 7 boxes being me, being with, as with others, seeking freedom, finding balance, making a difference, growing and developing, and having fun. Now, needless to say, I became immediately excited when I saw this because with a little shifting of the order, I was able to find a really nice alignment with the 7 domains I'm talking about. So one thing you can say about every model of well-being out there is that it has not been validated by people living with dementia. But now I feel like, at least in theory, I have some validation, thanks to the folks in MERIP. And you know, you might say when you look down that list, security, finding balance, it's not the whole thing, but security is very much balanced between too much and too little, between empowerment and quality of life and safety. There's a lot of kinds of balance that go on in security as well. So what does this have to do with culture change? Here we are at the Pioneer Conference. Well, it has everything to do with culture change. And I'm going to explain why. Boy, I see I'm taking a lot of time here, so I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit because I've got some important things I want to tell you. And you know culture change. The truth is that no matter what philosophy you have, if you bring it to an institution, the institution will kill it every time. Because institutions are made to resist change, to preserve the status quo, and they have mechanisms in place. And until you shift those operations to embrace new ideas, you can't change. So shifting operations to embrace new ideas, to me, is what we call sometimes, regrettably, culture change. But I know it's not a great word. But this is what we're trying to do. And so let me give you one of the biggest challenges of the talk: why non-pharmacological interventions don't work. Now, I know that a guy who wrote a book called Dementia Beyond Drugs shouldn't be saying something like this. I'm trying to provoke you a little bit. But this is what I'd like to say about this. Non-pharmacological interventions is not the idea of getting away from pills. It's that we still do it with a biomedical mindset. We haven't quite made the paradigm shift. And I want to tell you, what the characteristics are of many of our interventions. They tend to be reactive instead of proactive. When she does this, let's do this. They often are a laundry list that we create. Here's an algorithm of things we could try. Let's try aromatherapy. Let's try folding laundry, without really understanding the person. So that's where that coffee maker thing comes back to us. They're often discrete activities. They're all even treated like doses of pills sometimes. Pet a cat, TID before meals, that kind of thing, as if that's going to change a person's life. The daily laundry folding, as if that's going to change anything. And they're not tied into the person, knowing the person, and they're not tied into those domains of well-being. So here's an example. I was out in Iowa a few years ago speaking in a rural area, and I heard the story of a gentleman who'd moved into an assisted living home, and very shortly he started trying to go out the back door. And he would be redirected. They would attempt to engage him in other things, but obviously, needless to say, the more they redirected him, the more insistent and persistent he became. It became a real issue, and finally the manager said to them, listen, there's a fence, it's a nice day, why don't you just let him go once and watch him and see what he's trying to do. So the next time he went, they stood at the doorway, let him go, and he walked out to the back fence, and there was a cow pasture and a herd of cows behind the fence. And he stood there at the fence and watched them for about 15 minutes, and he came back inside, and he was happy all day. And they talked to the family about this, and the family said, well, he was a farmer. Every day he would check the cows. That's how he started his day. And so it's not just that they came up with a clever way of solving his issue, it's the bigger lesson, and that is that when we see people trying to leave, we may try aromatherapy, we may have them fold laundry, but what if they just want to check the cows? If you don't understand that, you're never going to solve the problem. And so we can't just come up with a laundry list, and this is why the non-pharmacologic approaches have such a poor evidence base in research. They do okay, they do better than antipsychotics, but they're still not what we'd like to see. Well, what do? We get a researcher who goes to a nursing home, picks 50 people, randomizes them, takes 25 of them, comes up with an intervention that she chooses, gives it to the people she chooses at a time she chooses, without any knowledge of who they are or what they need, and they're amazed when everybody doesn't have a great reaction to it. Once again, these things can be useful, but you have to know the person, and you have to know what they need if you really want to get behind that. So, as we talk about in culture change, there's structural change, there's personal change, that's a lot of what we're doing today. There's also that operational change. With dementia, I see physical as creating living environments that reflect the values of home, as Anna said this morning, real home, as the greenhouse people say. Personal with dementia is both intrapersonal, changing how I see that condition and see those people, but also interpersonal. It's sharpening my skills of communication and facilitation. And then the linchpin for me is the operational. The operational is important because neither a beautiful home or a holistic mindset will work if you don't start shifting those things. All those things on that list are important components of operational shifts, and many more that you'll probably hear about when Denise and Veronica speak later today about transformation. But it even gets to things like job descriptions and performance evals. If you tell people relationships are more important than tasks, but their annual performance eval is still a checklist of tasks, what are you going to get? Upton Sinclair says, it's hard to get a man to understand something if his paycheck depends on his not understanding it. So remember that. Now there's a larger message there for surveyors in the room. If you survey to tasks, you're going to get tasks because the facilities, the homes, paychecks, and their reason to be comes from surveys and reimbursement mechanisms. So that leads to, well, I'll get there in a minute. The other idea is it's not about nursing homes. If there is stigma, if there's lack of education, if there's lack of community support, if there's caregiver stress and burnout, and I put caregiver intentionally because most people see it as a one-way street. They don't understand how you can partner in care. If there's inability for that spouse or family member to flex their rhythms around the needs, not because it's their fault, but because there's so little community support. If there's social isolation, over-medication, then your own house can be as much of an institution as any nursing home you've ever seen. And that's why some people actually do better when they move to your long-term communities from their own house, because they had gotten into institutional living within their own homes. So that's the last secret. This culture change is for everyone. It is for regulators. It is for nursing homes. It's for doctors. It's for hospitals. It's for the community, for families. One part of this puzzle can't change if the others do not want to change too. We have to come out together and start with deep self-examination. How do we need to grow to make this better? So I'm going to give you some examples of operationalizing these domains of well-being, because we're going to get to a tool you can use. And in order to understand that tool, growth, meaning, how do you operationalize that stuff? It's kind of hard to figure out. So I'll give you some simple ones and some not so simple ones. This is, by the way, Burgerland Nursing Home, the first Eden Associated Nursing Home, Eden Registered Nursing Home in Denmark. And this was a woman who would get frazzled during the day but did not like going to her bedroom during the day, and so this aide would just help her nap by laying down with her. And once again, is this goofing off or is this meeting this person's well-being needs? Security, connectedness, whatever. So identity, the simplest thing you can do. And I like to give you things that take no more time, no more money, no more staff. Because three things you will never have is more time, more money, and more staff. Sorry to break it to you. Look at the demographics of aging. Look at our economy. That's the reality we live with, okay? It's working better. A simple thing. Ask somebody how they like to be addressed. Don't just assume they want to be called by their first name or whatever it is. Now, sundown syndrome. Should we cure that too? You may know. I don't know. Anybody here from Beatitudes campus in Phoenix, Arizona? Oh, thank you very much for being here. I've talked about Beatitudes in my new book because they've kind of cured sundowning for most people. Once again, we think it's inevitable from dementia. But what they've realized is that there are two things going on which I see as part of identity. Two aspects of identity are being triggered. One is the commotion of donning coats and saying goodbye and changing shifts triggers that identity. I have to go to work, I have to leave work and go home, I have to pick up my kids from school, whatever, okay? The second thing is our identity creates an individual rhythm of activity and rest. And we're forcing people into our rhythm of activity and rest. And I can make this room sundown. I do it all the time in my two-day seminars. You know, I have people that work from 7 to 3 o'clock, and they're on their feet all day, and I decide that I'm going to teach you from 8:30 to 5, and I make you sit most of the day. And about 2 or 3 o'clock, I see the doodling, I see the people stretching, getting coffee. Are you sundowning, or have I just forced you into an unnatural rhythm? So correct me if I'm wrong. What Beatitudes has done is two things primarily. Stop the commotion at the change of shift within sight of people, and have a rest as needed policy that gives people a chance to follow their more natural rhythm. And by doing that for what, 14 or 15 years now, you really have seen that mostly go away. Am I saying this correctly? Okay, so don't assume that because you have dementia, these things are inevitable. We cause excess disability. We cause a lot of trouble that we can remove. And when you do that, people can improve. Now, I want to spend a little time on connectedness. Now, I'm preaching to the choir here, so I'm probably going to get a skewed opinion. But let me just see, hold your hands up in the air if you work in a nursing home or assisted living environment. Now, I'm looking at the number here. Keep them up, keep them up, keep them up. Okay, I'm seeing probably about 70, 75, 80% of the room. Now, keep your hands up if you work in a place that has dedicated staff assignments. At least 90% of the time, you are not rotating. Okay, so we went down to about half. You are better than most. I did a talk with about 200 people in the room once, and when I asked those 200 people, most of whom worked in nursing homes, who was using dedicated assignments, about 15 or 20 raised their hands. Now, I'm going to make a case. This is the one place where I kind of lose it in my book and rant a little bit, okay? I put this on the slide. It's not on your PDF because I just added it. Kathy Greenblatt, a wonderful photographer, photo essayist, made a video called It Takes a Community. You can find it on YouTube. There's the link, but you just put It Takes a Community in the search bar. This is Our Care Australia. 22, soon to be 24 different communities around South and Eastern Australia. And this is my friend Daniela Greenwood, who you'll hear from in the book as well, who's their strategy and innovation manager. And Daniela did an appreciative inquiry to find out how she could take care to the next level. And she got some big themes. One of the big themes was connections, relationship. And she realized that the idea of rotating those hands-on staff who are so close to people was not fulfilling the domain of connectedness. And so she did something. Now, some of these have separate areas for people living with dementia, and some, like Helensvale, that's profiled in the video, actually have an integrated living environment. But she knew that for the people living with dementia, this lack of connectedness was even more important when you're forgetful than it is when you can kind of adjust to those changes. And so the survey showed that this was an important thing, and she began to formulate a pathway to make dedicated staff assignments in all the areas where people with dementia are living. She did a lot of staff education, paradigm shifting, had a reapplication process. People reapplied for their jobs, and she used questionnaires and tools that helped them measure who would be the best people to work with people with dementia. Daniela says, if you're a football team, you put your best men on the field every week because you want to win. You want to do the best you can. Why aren't we doing that for the most vulnerable people in our society? Why don't we expect the best from people every single day and insist on those close relationships? All staff had to commit to at least 3 shifts per week, and they are much more than the 80 or 85% that goes into most research studies. She got positive feedback, which is really interesting because this gets a lot of pushback, but both staff and managers liked it and wanted to do it. And within 6 weeks of the initial home, staff were spending more time with elders without sacrificing any task completion. Now it's been going on for a little over a year now in the early homes. Other ones have been rolled in over time. But one early adopting community has seen a 70% decrease in chest infections compared with the previous 6 months and with the same season of the year before. If there are fewer people touching you and coughing on you, you're not going to get sick as often. 100% elimination of pressure sores, 100% decrease in formal complaints from family members, decrease in staff in one living area from 48 to 26, and the decrease in the average day and evening care partners touching a person during the month went from 26 to 4, okay? And every week, that elder and maybe their family members get a notice telling them who are going to be the people caring for their loved one that week, and there's that accountability there. After 12 months, there's still no pressure sores and a 28% decrease in staff call-ins for sick days. And 2 communities, early adopting communities, have had 0% turnover. So there's that. In my book, I tick off all well-being domains and talk about how rotating staff erodes those domains. I'm not going to go through that here. But here are 2 huge studies from the US of thousands of nursing homes showing improvements in clinical parameters, improvements in survey deficiencies, improvements, oops, spell check got me, in CNA turnover and absenteeism in these homes that use at least 80 to 85% dedicated assignments. And 2 recent studies talking about, quote, aggressive behavior, a word I used in my first book, but I've stopped using, both studies found a major factor in that physical reactivity to be the amount and quality of staff-elder relationship. So if you send strangers in to bathe somebody, they have a higher chance of getting struck and beat up by someone they don't know. So I put some rather strong words in my book. Here's one of those buttons I'm going to push. To summarize, dedicated assignments enhance well-being on multiple fronts, foster collaborative and accountable work environments, improve clinical care, reduce conflict, and improve satisfaction by people living with dementia and their families. And the organization that does not provide dedicated assignments offers a lower quality of care than they could otherwise. End of discussion. So I'm willing to engage that further, but this is a huge issue. Security, I can't go through all these, but I do want to touch on a couple important points. Knocking on the door. Simplest way to improve security is to give somebody a space they control, and that space is their bedroom. Don't ever enter it without identifying yourself and getting permission. Otherwise, how many of you would leave your door open and let people walk in at 2 in the morning without permission and consider that safe living or feel comfortable going to sleep at night? I also put another strong opinion that no new renovation should ever be done anymore in this country unless that new building has all private rooms. And I won't go into discussion. You can read about it if you want to read the book. Body language is so huge. People living with dementia who have less access to memories are much more attuned to nonverbal communication. And if we are not aware of our body language, we set things off. And there's a verbal connection because when we use labeling terms like behavior problem, difficult people, acting out, it causes us to adopt a body language when we approach that person based on how we feel about them. And that body language speaks louder than our kindest words. And we get negative energy meeting with negative energy. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And what's more, if we use those words in our shift reports or in our charting, then everybody who reads or hears those words also adopts that body language. And that poor person is confronted by negative energy 24 hours a day. And there's that self-fulfilling prophecy when the behavior problem actually becomes a behavior problem because we have brought that on. I'll give you the quick meaning thing. I'll do this real quickly, and then I want to leave some time for some discussion. This is something that Richard's quote that I gave you and also Christine Bryden's quote that she believes people with dementia are making an important journey from logic or from cognition into emotion and finally at the end of their lives into spirit. I realize the more I've worked with this well-being and with this type of communication that there's something important that we keep missing, that I've missed so many times. And that is that we live in that world that's dominated by logic, facts, and memories. Most people we are supporting live in a world that's dominated more by emotions and symbolism because they can't access those other bits of information. And the nonverbal is really important. And the problem is we don't try to communicate with them. We try to bring them to our world. So if someone says, I'm looking for my mother, we're stuck between that bipolar, do we tell them the truth and get them all upset? Or do we tell them a lie, she's at the store, and then erode our trust when it doesn't come to pass? The answer is you don't do either one. You understand the emotion and symbolism, not the fact of I'm looking for my mother. What else are you looking for? Just like the person who's saying, I want to go home, but is looking for well-being. And I was telling this up in Juneau, Alaska at a assisted living, and we had a talk and a potluck dinner and then an evening social hour. And the woman came up to me and said, boy, when you told me about that lesson, it helped me solve a problem I've been having with my mother tonight. And I said, great, tell me what happened. And she said, you know, my mother moved in a few weeks ago. She's extremely forgetful. And every time I come in at night after work to visit her, when I say I'm going now, good night, she says, where are you going to sleep? She gets a little nervous. And I say to her, well, I'm going to sleep in my bed. I'm going home, of course. And every time her mother gets upset and she wants to go home and she misses her husband and the tears flow, and it had become so difficult for this woman that she was going to cut down her visits because she just couldn't deal with this every night. So she heard this and she said, okay, I'm in the world of where are you going to sleep? What's she really saying? What's the symbolism? And I decided that what she's saying is she's still my mother. She cares about my safety, my happiness, my well-being. So that night, she took her back to her room and she said, I'm going. And her mother said, where are you going to sleep? And she said, Mom, I've got the best place to sleep tonight. I've got a great book and I'm going to make a cup of tea and curl up in bed and have a wonderful night. And her mother smiled and said good night and she walked out the door. So when you understand what's behind it, and when you go realize the emotion, I'm looking at Evie back there, validating the emotion you see, because that's how the person's processing the world, and then explore the meaning behind it and provide the well-being. A woman in England talked about a woman who kept asking for her mother, and people did the two things, you know, and neither of them worked. And finally, she stopped and she said, boy, I'm sorry you miss your mother. And she sat there visiting with that emotion and validating that. And then she said, tell me, if your mother were here now, what would she do? And without hesitating, the woman said, she would love me. And what she realized was this woman was not getting affectionate care from the people around her. And that gave them an insight into what she was really asking for in her own way. So how do you use this? Well, this well-being approach can be used for ongoing support and care. Your care plan can become a well-being plan. You still have to talk about the alteration in blood sugar, but you can talk about those 7 domains too. And it can be used for decoding distress. And I see these well-being domains as glasses that, because of not only the illness of dementia, but the way we care for people, have become less and less full, sometimes nearly empty. And so I often will engage people in an exercise where I have somebody talk about a real-life situation that's challenging them. And I break people into 7 groups after they get all the information they can. And you know how it works. People, when I say, okay, would you like to ask the presenter more questions for background? You get a lot of, have you tried this, have you tried that? Because that's our mindset. And of course, these talented people have tried everything we can think of. So I break people into 7 groups. I give each group 1 well-being domain. And I say, okay, put a drinking glass on your flip chart and put a liquid level. How full is this person's identity right now based on what you've heard? How full is her autonomy? How full is her security? And then put aside the cough and go for the pneumonia. This is the hardest thing. Turn your back on the behavior and just build well-being 24/7. Forget the time. If someone's striking you during the bath, forget the bath. You may have already visited the mechanics of the bath. Talk about, how do I give this person more identity throughout the day in addition to the bath? How do I give this person more autonomy throughout the day? This is counterintuitive because we're trying to fix the distress. Instead, ignore it and just give the person well-being. It's not a quick fix. That person won't be better tomorrow. But in a few weeks, you're going to be saying, that person doesn't get upset during a bath anymore. And then when you take the pills away, they'll stay away. You won't have a yo-yo effect because you give the person what they really need. The big insight that I see is when I ask people to show me the drinking glasses. Because here are some talented people that have tried everything they can think of. And it is rare for those glasses ever to be more than 25% full. And most of them are just about empty. So here are 7 huge areas of human need that our system of care has not even begun to address, in spite of doing everything we think we know how to do. And that shows why so much of this distress is hard to answer. So when you have that person who can't talk, who has no family, who you don't know the background, try this. It's amazing what it can do when you just ignore what's going on and just give this person well-being. Because when we don't have well-being, it gives us ill-being, and that's what leads to a lot of this. That's my theory. I have no evidence base yet. I'm looking for you to try it, to study it, to tell me if it works or not. I would love to partner with researchers on this. I'm going to leave with one of Dr. Natter's quotes, and it's only about, it's not even quite 12:15. And what I wanted to do is leave at least 15 minutes to talk about whatever you want to talk about going from here. But I love this quote by Natter: when we care for an elder, we care for that part of ourselves that will someday grow old. And I might even take Natter one step further and say when we care for a forgetful person, we care for that part of ourselves that may also someday forget. And so I'm going to stop formal comments here. And I would love to have some discussion and find out what people would like to hear about during our remaining time. Yes, I'm going to go to Evie, but yeah, Cayman. I do. Beautiful. Let me get off airplane mode. I didn't want anybody to bother me. This is the only way I can get my phone off airplane mode for some reason. It doesn't work this way. But okay, Evie in the back. Evie, by the way, is a certified validation specialist, as well as being a wonderful care partner and a great educator on dementia from Vivage in Colorado. Go ahead, Evie, just say it, and then I'll repeat the question, too.
I love listening to you.
Thanks.
Here's a neurochemical question. So there's a study of epigenetics and functional medicine that now is getting a lot of press, a lot of attention. They're calling Alzheimer's disease diabetes type 3.
Yeah, type 3 diabetes, Evie. She's got a mic now, but for the people live streaming, this epigenetic theory that there's a big glucose transport issue in the brain.
So I just want to know what your thoughts on this, because I mean, I'm looking at a room full of people that if our food is so toxic and our food is non-food anymore, and if there is a connection, I mean, this is a room full of people who maybe can look in that direction.
I do believe, by the way, I eat eggs, I eat egg yolks, and I try to avoid high fructose corn syrup. I think this mania about cholesterol is a little bit wrong. I think it's the other stuff that's actually getting us in more trouble. But anyway, but to answer the question from my point of view, and once again, you're going to hear opinion from me. This is opinion, not fact necessarily, not agreed upon fact. And I addressed this in the last chapter of my book, which is, it's called Aging and Dementia in the 21st Century, Reclaiming and Reframing Hope, or something like that. But my sort of pet name for the chapter that I didn't publish is, anyone I haven't pissed off by now, I'll try to get them in the last chapter. I'll tell you what I believe about Alzheimer's, and we'll narrow it down to Alzheimer's, because we know that there are 50 or 60 kinds. I believe that Alzheimer's is not one disease. And I think if we took any organ of the body and looked at how that organ ages as exquisitely as we've looked at the brain, we would see that there's inflammation, there's vascular issues, there's glucose metabolism, there's misfolding of proteins. I think these researchers are blind men around the elephant, and one is feeling the tail, one's feeling the trunk, and that Alzheimer's is not one disease, but it's a final common pathway for a lot of different things that can happen to you. A little bit your genes, not much. There's only 1% that really have that high risk. But a little bit of genetic risk, then lots of things that happen to you during your life, which could be lifestyle, it could be diet, it could be environment, it could be life choices, life experiences. And I think that a lot of things can happen to us. There is one thing that is strongly associated with risk for Alzheimer's, and that's the number of years your brain has been alive and exposed to the world. And it is almost impossible to separate dementia from the experience of aging. And that's why I have a little controversy, but I do not believe that there'll ever be a day when people don't forget more than we think is normal. And so I am all for research. I'm all for drugs to try to prevent the onset of changing ability. But if we put too much emphasis on cure, we create a world where difference is not tolerated. And we think that the only way we can give you a quality of life is to make you hold your breath till the next pill comes along. And we see a lot of this going on, and I worry about what people call the medicalization of deviance when I'm in a society where I can't quite measure up because they haven't found a way to fix me yet and make me more like the rest of us. And so I think there's that subtle message, and no one does it to be evil, but I think we have to balance care versus cure in a different way than we're doing right now. That's my personal feeling. I knew I'd get in trouble before this hour and a half was over. Thanks, Evie, for pushing me off the cliff. Okay. Yeah, if you read the book, you'd get there anyway. Probably. Kevin is so much more tech savvy than I am. Okay, so we have a couple things now. Leonid Orlov from Seattle asks, is this part of your community that you've been working with up there? Okay, you don't know. How do we get around lack of resources, e.g. staff to individualize care in order to truly provide person-centered care, like taking residents for walks, engagement in various activities? Okay, there's a bunch of, I'll give you some answers. They may seem a little simplistic, but I don't have a lot of time. First of all, what this culture change pathway teaches us is that even though we may not have more staff, when we break those dreaded silos that Steve Shields talked about this morning, we actually create time. We create efficiencies. My old CEO, Charlie Runyon, used to say, in an institution, dining services cleans the top of the table and housekeeping cleans the legs. That's kind of what we got into here. And we have these silos that don't talk to each other, that don't really work together. You know, the social worker comes up and writes a note, sees the person, the doctor comes up and does it, the nurse does a note. And yeah, they have care plans, but how often is that group with the elder and family truly collaborating about daily life? That's where we really have to get to that. So there are efficiencies, and just like Daniela's group showed in Australia, when people moved to dedicated assignments, one initiative, they were spending more time with people. The greenhouse model, thanks to Siobhan Sharkey, showed that people in the greenhouse model spend more minutes per day with those elders, in spite of the additional duties, in spite of all the things going on. So there are ways to do that. Also, this is a great way to engage your community. Bring in family members who feel like they've lost that caregiving role when they turn their loved one over, so to speak. Engage them in helping with this. Engage your volunteers, larger community. Elizabeth Knox Home in Auckland, New Zealand, has an incredible volunteer program, a small home that has hundreds of volunteers, many more volunteers than the people who live and work there. What they've done to engage the community is huge. And this also gets to the larger idea of engaging a community, creating age-inclusive and dementia-inclusive communities. And I'm sorry, folks, I know what you do is great, and I know we'll always need some skilled care. But the future to where we're going to be in aging in 2050 is not to build lots more CCRCs. We have got to find ways to create communities that are truly inclusive where people live. Age-inclusive and dementia-inclusive. And the UK is way ahead of us. They just, one company taught 17,000 bus drivers about dementia so that the people get on their bus, they'll be able to understand and help. I mean, they are so far ahead of us, and I'm glad there are things like the Project in Liberty that Steve talked about, but we have a long way to go. Okay, thank you, Angela. Yes?
Well, we just went through that experience with the alarm. We had a separated neighborhood of 58 families, so we ended up doing the bracelet thing and alarm, just like that.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, we got down to that thought of, you know, were we institutionalizing them by making them fearful of getting close to the door?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And you know, there are lots of stigmas that we create that we don't think about. And you know, I realized something else about when I had the greenhouse experience, and that is the things that we do that are just band-aids for a bad system. So, for example, wayfinding cues. Now, every article on Design for Dementia talks about wayfinding cues. Well, yeah, they are important when you don't know where you're going. But you know what? At those greenhouses at St. John's, people don't get lost. They don't end up in the wrong place. They know where their rooms are. There's no names. The state made us put numbers on the door, even though we didn't want them, so they're right down by the floor where nobody can see them except the inspectors when they come, you know. But people don't get lost because we don't create a place where they don't feel at home and can't find their way. Another great example of the Band-Aid is the double rooms. And you know, the biggest pushback I get about private rooms is two things. Number one, people often make friends with their roommate. And number two, some people feel insecure, and having someone there at night makes them feel safer. So here's my counter argument. We create insecurity in the way we care for people in long-term care. First of all, people are endlessly adaptable. So if you're going to live with somebody the rest of your life who you didn't choose, chances are you're going to make the best of it. And you might become excellent friends. But how many of you eat, sleep, share a bathroom with your best friend, if they're not your life partner, for the rest of your life? That isn't necessary. Now, the reason people feel insecure at night is because we barge in without knocking, because we don't respect dignity and modesty during care, because we rotate staff. When you create security in other places, they don't look for it in a roommate. And the other thing my friend Emmy Kyoto mentions is that when people don't have privacy in one place in their life, they're less likely to engage outside the room because they're constantly seeking as much privacy as they can. When you give them privacy, they're more likely to be willing to come out and engage in group activities or group engagement because they have that balance in their life that we all need. We all need privacy. And I believe we all need a dedicated space to sleep, to use the bathroom, to be sexually intimate, to have important conversations, and everybody needs that, no matter where they live. That's my personal belief. And you know, you go to Australia, Denmark, they look at you funny when you talk about double rooms. There are none in those countries. They never went down that road. I'm not sure why we did. Cost, I guess. What's the cost of having people that don't like living together? Other questions? We still have a little time. Yes? Did you send me a, thank you. Okay, Peggy from South Dakota. Thank you, Peggy. Please respond to shifting the survey task to looking at domains of well-being. I think it's a wonderful idea, Peggy. And I will repeat that reference too. I think that, like I said, everybody needs to grow. And once again, the best way is to collaborate and partner. I've taught my course in a couple of big states, Kentucky and Tennessee, and this year Mississippi, through CMP grants. And one of the things we did in teaching the course was we had surveyors and providers sitting at the same tables together. And we made people sit together. And you know who hated it? The surveyors. They all wanted to sit at the same table. And we got Vince Davis in Tennessee to tell the surveyors, the DOH, no, you can't sit with each other. You've got to spread out. But by the end of the 2 days, people loved it. They saw each other as human beings, and all this, you know, blaming each other for not getting it right goes away because we're all good people who are trying to achieve the same goals in our own way. So collaboration is really huge. And here's another place where I'll get in trouble. I started down this road on a conference call about CMP funds in New York yesterday, and I decided to back off and choose my battlefield. But this idea that surveyors can't coach and educate people because they'll lose their objectivity, to me, is insane. Every school teacher in every school in the country helps kids grow and then gives them a grade at the end of the period. And maybe that has been abused, but deal with the abuse. When you give somebody a narrow role as an enforcer, you create a different kind of person with a very narrow, cynical view of what their mission in life is. And there are wonderful surveyors out there, but you have to fight that stigma all the time. And there are some people that are drawn to the enforcement role and don't want to help people grow. And I think it's insulting to surveyors to think that you can't help the people you serve and still be objective when you walk in there and see how they're doing. Every boss does that every day. And I think it's insulting to the surveyors in the room to say that you don't have the ability to do that too. That's my personal feeling. Now the link for the Our Care video, it takes a community. Just think of it takes a village, but it's community instead of village. It's on YouTube. It's Kathy Greenblatt with 1 T at the end of her name is the videographer. And Our Care, A-R-C-A-R-E, is the community. And it's about a 15-minute video. And Daniela, the thing she says, she just has the ability to speak so easily and so brilliantly about these concepts, you know. And she talks about how, you know, people do grow old and they do grow frail, you know, and that's part of life. But this idea that being old means just dealing with sickness is a wrong idea. That old equates to medical care. We have to think about other things people need, and one of those things is life. You know, and this is really important. And that's why I get stuck on the word care a little bit, because you know, one of the most mind-expanding books I read in researching mind was a book by Ruth Bartlett and Deborah O'Connor about social citizenship, seeing dementia from the framework of social citizenship. Care narrows our discussion to, can they go outside by themselves? Can they decide when to get out of bed? How about engaging in civic activities? How about going to the museum and engaging in art? How about being part of a project team? How about interviewing people? The homes in Centricare, Mississippi. Maybe I have a few minutes. So Centricare, Mississippi, wonderful assisted living and skilled care around Mississippi. Actually use not only elders, but elders living with dementia in their group interviews of prospective employees. And they had a woman with dementia once who sat in on an interview, and this shows that special skill. And the woman interviewed, and they went around the table after she left, and everybody said, yep, sounds good to me, yep. I don't know if it was a nurse or CNA, but they all said, yeah, she'd be a good staff member. They got to the woman living with dementia, and the woman said, I wouldn't hire her. And they all looked at her and said, what do you mean? And she proceeded to tell them all the stuff they didn't see. Her poor eye contact, her tone of voice, her body language. She was an expert in interviewing. She was saying all the right words, but she was showing that she didn't believe it. And based on that woman's advice, they did not hire that applicant. So what can people do? My friend Tara Stringfellow in Perth with the Alzheimer's Australia, Western Australia group, got a grant. And when people are diagnosed with Alzheimer's in the community, they locate them and they immediately connect them with a volunteer role in the community. So when the rest of society is saying you have a disease, you are incapable, they're saying we need you, come out and help your community. There are many ways to change the dialogue, and we have to engage these in a bigger way than we have. Do I still have time, Angela? Are we still okay?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. What do you got that takes 2 minutes? Gavin, you didn't send me anything else, did you? I know there's more out there. Don't be shy. There's no such thing as stupid questions, only stupid presenters. Okay, I'll tell you a joke. We're talking about changing perspectives. I thought about telling the joke instead of the coffee maker metaphor. Was that any good, by the way? Should I use that? Or was it okay? Okay. This is changing perspectives. One of my favorite jokes. It's a little bizarre, but that's the way I am, as you will learn. Yeah, Evie, you're going to love this joke. So a guy's sitting reading the newspaper, and he hears a little knock at the door, and he goes over to the door and opens it up and looks around. Nobody there. Looks left, right. Looks down. There's a snail on the stoop of the door. So he just kicks the snail across the lawn, closes the door, goes back and reads his newspaper. 3 years later, he's reading the newspaper, and he hears another knock at the door, and he goes out, looks around, doesn't see anybody, looks down, there's a snail on the step again. The snail looks up at him and he says, what was that all about? So there. Thanks very much, everybody.